If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. 1 year ago, after Russia started the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz talked about the Zeitenwende. After 12 months, can we now fulfill the term Zeitenwende with something concrete, or not really, and why?
To use a German quip, I think it depends on how much Zeit Germany has, how much time Germany has. I think it depends upon short run and long run effect. The problem with the German political system generally is that it takes a huge amount of effort to build the consensus for fast action. I think what has been remarkable, if we view it as an aspect of the Zeitenwende, is the massive shift in Germany's energy production system and energy market. That has been a sudden move, but it was also driven by a lack of choice. I think the German government, after the beginning of the invasion, after it became clear that actions that should have been taken 4, 5, 6 years ago, perhaps even before 2014, were now overdue and were now inevitable. It was relatively, Robert Habeck is an excellent organizer, but it was relatively clear that his ministry, Robert Habeck's ministry, had to move quickly, and for the German industrial system to survive, that this action needed to be taken now. But that is a kind of a short run effect there. There's a long run effect there in that it also fed into long established debates and discussions about shifting Germany's energy policy. So the move had to be done now. The consensus shifted, but it did build on a decade, 10 to 15 years of work and planning and basically sort of concepts and ideas and plans that had been basically in various drawers that just had to be taken out, put down and put into action now that there was finally national will for that. So if there's an aspect of it that matches the speed and urgency of the current crisis, I think the shift in Germany's energy markets, which is, I think, is because it's now being taken for granted, I think, which is quite fascinating. One of the things I've been fascinated by in this crisis generally is how developments that were considered impossible or unlikely or unusual, they've happened and now are taken as a conventional wisdom, like the things that this is always going to happen. I think it almost feels as if this time last year almost feels like a different era. That's the energy market.
What about the other areas? Defense, military, security.
When it comes to defense, I think a broader reorientation of Germany's not just military, but security services, diplomatic corps, strategic culture even. There is a set of decisions that have been made that I think will have substantial long-run effects, but I do wonder whether they have been taken with the speed and been able to build the level of consensus and momentum for them to match the urgency of this particular moment now, this kind of short-term crisis that we have. I think one of the paradoxes, not just of German policymaking, but EU policymaking as a whole, is that you have vast decisions that are made, but sometimes they're very slow because these are slow consensus-based institutions, and then you see their effects at the end of the crisis, right? So it may mean that in the long term, Germany will have a stronger military, it will have more assets. If the biggest problem Germany faces is actually a recruitment crisis in terms of personnel, maybe that might be resolved. We'll have to see. We might have a greater coordination and integration of European militaries, not a European army. That's something different, but within the aegis of NATO, but NATO now working together much more closely with the EU. That's perfect almost strategically for Germany. I mean, that all is going to happen. You can also see the new plans and development plans for a new generation of tanks, artillery, equipment, a speeding up of industrial production of military equipment, but that's not going to kick in the next 18 months. It's going to build frustration among allies.
For sure, it will create some frustration. So when you say this is a long-term issue, can you give me a rough time estimate?
I think that if we look at in terms of equipment and procurement decisions and structural decisions, perhaps also discussions around better pay, pensions deals, wider recruitment, also targeting immigrant communities, inclusive for recruitment. So there's an interesting, potentially dubious, I don't think it's necessarily dubious, but others might see so in terms of viewing immigrants as communities have less of a lower threshold in terms of willingness to enter into military career. There's also an interesting psychological shift in German state institutions. I think on the one hand, you can target the late 2020s, early 2030s before you really see a solid payoff. This is going to take time. The problem is that if every other European military was working at this pace, and some are, like the British military is also paralyzed, and the British like to sort of present themselves as, and which they have done, they have played a hugely positive and very proactive role in supporting Ukraine. The British military itself has been suffered even worse than the Bundeswehr in some ways through decades of austerity. And the British military is going to take years to recover from that. The problem is if that was all the Bundeswehr had to face, then German governments could say, look, it's not just us, it's all these other countries. However, the speed with which Poland is rearming and expanding is remarkable. And that is running in a short run cycle. Finland has already asserted its position. The Romanians, people tend to underestimate Romania generally, I think. They've made some substantial decisions and ramped ammunition production. They're purchasing HIMARS left, right, and center. Even the Italians, before this conflict, though they'd made cuts and there were problematic decisions made in terms of land forces, they have expanded their navy. Like there's a big, massive naval, Italian, it's not so much expanded, but they've qualitatively increased numbers of certain kinds of ships. They've replaced one for one the big capital ships, the aircraft carriers. Like the Italians can say, look, okay, we have to work on our land forces a bit again, but in terms of their naval investment, they've done substantial things within the current timeframes. So I think the problem the Bundeswehr and the French are actually moving very quickly now. And so the problem the Bundeswehr faces, the German government faces, is in a sense, it's coming back and saying, look, in the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years' time, we will have something that can be useful for Europe. Unfortunately, that you can't make that argument anymore and be taken seriously because so much other European countries, several other key European countries are moving much faster than Germany. I think, by the way, that's a problem the British will face as well because they're not moving fast enough. So, yeah, I think optimism. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but I think concretely in an 8, 9, 10-year time frame, you might have editorials or think pieces written by Polish columnists about how the German army is too big, but who knows? But I think that the problem that Germany faces is that the Polish army is going to be bigger. The French are moving faster. The Italians can say, well, we've done this naval investment. And it's happening faster than the Bundeswehr will. And then again, people will say, why are you doing this so slowly? And I think a lot of patience has run out about the German arguments about it being a consensus-based system and you have all these structural problems. It's going to take time. Well, one thing the EU and EU member states have to get better at is reacting faster, right, to crises. And there we have two stories. We have the story of the German energy market and energy policy, which has been remarkable, and the story of German defense policy, which is slow.
What is Chancellor Schultz's role in the Zeitenwende? It literally requires the turning of time. Is he up to this task?
I think Schultz's problem, I've been very critical of Schultz because I think Schultz is actually a pretty smart administrator. I think he knows how to organize and run large organizations. He showed that as mayor of Hamburg. He has a very strong grasp of policy. You can disagree. I would disagree with some of his, policy approaches and some of his arguments, but he's not. To claim that he's incompetent as an administrator and as someone who can govern is ridiculous. Where he is problematic is his communicative style. I don't think he's necessarily made the psychological shift from being a mayor of Hamburg or a finance minister, where you can stay out of the debate for long periods of time and then just come in and maybe tip debate and then step out again. As a chancellor, you're under demand. You are the center of attention. You're the focus of the political system. So you have to maintain a constant and clear flow of communication about your intentions, a clear sense of where you're going. Also, a clear explanation of, for example, the rationale. Why did the Americans have to present the M1A1 tanks? Why could Germany not have donated Leopard 2s alone? Why could Germany not take the lead? If we go to that decision, the problem is that one of the issues that sort of hampers his ability to communicate, which I think is his weakest skill, in any case, he's not a great communicator. He also has to manage a political party with the Social Democratic Party with substantial wings within it that still are struggling to abandon a certain image of Russia, a certain image of diplomacy, a certain hostility to the military and a hostility to military expansion, which is more a product of a boomer, shall we say, generation of Social Democrats, the wartime generation of Social Democrats who ran it in the 60s, came through the Second World War, ran it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were quite, robust on military policy. This is actually more recent development, social democracy, reflection of the boomer generation within it. And so there's a substantial part of the SPD still deeply invested in certain notions of dialogue, diplomacy, suspicion of military spending. And also the fact that on a simple, practical party political terms, every German political party has different regional power centers and wings. It's the essence of the federal system. So, for example, he had this defense minister, Christine Lambrecht, who was frankly not very good at the job, but she had to be given the post because she came from a certain regional network. Now he's handed it to Boris Pistorius, so I was skeptical about, not because he's a bad administrator, because I always thought him of a very regional figure in Lower Saxon politics, but he's grown into, he seems to have been the classic guy who has got the 62, it's his final big job, so he wants to go out with a splash. So maybe, and he's certainly a good administrator, so he's more ambitious than I thought he would be, and he's certainly got the skills, whether he had the ambition to do anything. Well, he's showing that now, to my surprise. He's a Lower Saxon, so this creates problems in the party because there's too many people from my province where I grew up, Lower Saxony at the top. So Schultz has to manage all of these tensions, and he has to manage a liberal coalition partner and a green coalition partner. Liberals are very transatlanticist. The Greens are very, really do not like the Russian government and the Russian system. So they pull policy in different directions away from the SPD. So partly this is Schultz is not a very good communicator. That's I'm very critical of. Some of, I think, his views of how to run these policies, I think, are problematic. I think he's very reluctant to take the lead. I think Germany needs to start taking the lead in military affairs, increasingly in Europe. But I also have to acknowledge, I think we have to acknowledge the extent to which he's in a very difficult position of a three-party coalition and is an SPD party that for ideological and generational reasons is really struggling to adapt to the new geopolitical conditions.
You mentioned the Greens, and I think it's quite clear that the Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock is the most visible member of the German government for the audience abroad. Partly, it defines her job, but still, if you compare her approach to Scholz, what do you see?
I think it's easier for Annalena Baerbock because she has her party behind her. And I think one of the most fascinating stories generally in European politics, I'm actually close to the Green Party myself, so just to make sure that I'm being honest, but I would still argue that the Green Party is one of the most fascinating developments and evolutions in European politics because it went from a really radically pacifist position in its origins in the 1980s and the anti-nuclear protest that still is a lingering issue in terms of its commitment to nuclear disarmament and its hostility to nuclear power. But in the 1990s, there are a number of different factors happened. For example, many Green activists had come into contact with Solidarność and East European civil society movements. That changed their, understanding, that pulled them away from other parts of the left in terms of an understanding about relations with Russia. A lot of the East German dissident movements and figures who had suffered really for their opposition to the SED and to the East German government flowed in to the Green Party. There are a lot of immigrant milieux involved in the Green Party, their own reasons. So out of that, you have a number of factors in the 1990s where the Greens are confronted with a set of choices in response to the Yugoslav wars, about you either opt for pacifism or you opt for military action to stop mass atrocities like Srebrenica. And it was a traumatic period for the Green Party, but out of that there was this famous speech in 1999 at a party conference in relation to the decisions about the air campaign against Serbia over the war in Kosovo, where there was really decision was made that if there was a choice between preventing Auschwitz and preventing war, you always go for preventing Auschwitz. That's sort of the argument. So that military action is acceptable under certain moral conditions. And so that has gone from being a kind of a point of division to a defining aspect. I think that's really the interesting thing. They're maybe the last people who believe in responsibility to protect. They put very strict caveats on it. So it means that when it comes to Baerbock now, she's in a much freer position than Scholz. She can go out there and say, we believe in human rights and we believe in preventing atrocities. And yes, we are left-wing and we have very strict guidelines as to when this happens. But in Ukraine case, this is happening. And there's also a visceral hostility among much of the Green Party against the Putin regime, partly because of their East European links with civil society, partly also because of LGBT issues, very important human rights issues, minority rights issues that all are neuralgic points, environmental issues, like let's say oil and gas. It also makes it easier for Habeck, who's the other very prominent face of the coalition, to push energy reform because he can say, okay, we have to do these liquid natural gas projects, it's bad, but we can recondition them to hydrogen. So this is also, the Greens are kind of instrumentalizing this process to promote green and a greening of the German economy. On the one hand, yes, the Greens are much more forward, but it's easier for them to do this ideologically because it's important to understand the back history, but also how it just all aspects of the war against Ukraine hit key neuralgic ideological points of the Green Party. It's much easier for them to push this forward than it is necessarily for Social Democrats. The FDP don't have difficulties with this either, but that's because they're just innate transatlanticism.
If I return to some of your points you made about defense and security, from the beginning of the Russian invasion, Germany was criticized, especially by Ukraine and the allies from Eastern Europe, for doing too little and being too slow. How much do you agree with this criticism? Does it constructively push Germany into action, or could it be also counterproductive?
It depends who makes the message. I think I'm sort of in two minds. I think I have found remarkable how much Germany has moved, but I also agree with those who think it hasn't moved enough. That's the nuance. On the one hand, I think it's gone much further than it has in the past 30 years. And that's why it's so important to have the Greens in government, although that one might have to argue for bias on my part there. But I think on that, they have gone a long way. I think in terms, however, pressure was also needed. Pressure from outside helps those within German society making these arguments. Somebody like Baerbock and others within the German center-right and center-left can say, look, like also on the CDU side, can say, look, we are embarrassing ourselves as a country and as government in relation to our partners in the Czech Republic or our partners in Romania and our partners in Poland, frankly, partners in Italy, if we just look at the Italian naval investment in France because of France's just speed with which they're moving on a host of other aspects related to this. And especially our partners in the United States. Why can Germany not take the lead? Why does Germany have to hold America's hand? The Americans actually at this point have reconciled themselves to the concept of European strategic autonomy. And actually, I think quite shrewdly are shifting France towards thinking of it not as in terms of a rivalry with the United States, but as a partnership. And does more. It's in Europe's self-interest and it's in America's interest because Americans have to shift to China. So Germany should be a central role in all this. And I think without a lot of external prodding, a particular party like the Social Democrats in government, but also the kind of institutional inertia within the German military bureaucracy and state bureaucracy, which really holds up a lot. So a lot of this can't move unless there is this external pressure, people saying, look, got to do this. It also makes it easier for German governments to take the German population with them because they can say, look, it's not just, we're not being militaristic here. The rest of Europe wants us to do this. My caveat to that is it depends who, particularly in Eastern Europe, is making this argument. I think the Polish government in particular, PIS, has also used this clearly. The PIS party governing Poland has also clearly used this for electoral purposes domestically to stoke anti-German resentment in ways you can clearly see on Twitter and other social media, in ways that are really problematic when picked up by, say, Anglo-American or French or Italian voices don't know what this is about in a Polish domestic context. And that, of course, if you go too far in that, are too aggressive, and then to raise the issues of reparations and the war and just frame this in terms of Germany is just kind of irredeemable, that Germany's irredeemable, well, that's just going to be counterproductive. Like we go back into like Eurozone patterns in a different context where pushing the Germans too hard in a certain way and using a certain kind of language actually is counterproductive. But, we have people like Petr Pavel and the Czech government. Right? You have the Slovak government. You have the Klaus Johannes, the Romanian government. I so often wish that the people taking the lead in Eastern Europe prodding Germany would not be the Polish government. Ukrainian government, they had an ambassador early on, Andriy Melnik, who was a bit, ambitious and wild, and he had to go in the end. But, the Ukrainian government, once they took him out, have been very shrewd about handling the Germans. I think the Finns, the Lithuanians, the Romanians, the Czechs, the Slovaks should take the lead on this in terms of prodding Germany. I think this current Polish government, its instincts are so Germanophobic often that it is counterproductive. I actually think, in a sense, Duda is the least, he's actually been sensible, but there's other figures. Kaczynski, the outriders of PIS and Polish policy, where you just have to think, guys, you are really not helping anyone with this. There's another way of prodding Germany, and just look at Klaus Johannes and the Romanians, how they're handling this, or the Finns. That's how you do it.
I move our debate to the EU level. For now, Hungary is basically the only country that publicly criticized the EU approach towards Russia. And of course, the unity is not perfect, but do you think that it can last, even if the war continues for some years?
I think this is the interesting thing, misunderstanding about how the EU functions. I think the EU is slow, and it's difficult to shift its consensus, and there's so many veto players. And that can be profoundly negative when things have to move in a better direction or a more robust direction, say, towards Russia. However, this inertia can sometimes be an advantage, because once all of this immense effort has been made to shift the entire system into a new position, it begins to develop a new inertia. It begins to sort of sit in this position. It becomes entrenched. It becomes institutional conventional wisdom, whole new departments in the European External Action Service and the trade, DG Trade. And, there's a whole apparatus emerges. There's an apparatus in Frontex now about handling Russian border risks. And increasingly, what is this huge move becomes just entrenched consensus. Now that these decisions have been made, EU bureaucratic inertia is our friend, right? Because it just becomes more difficult to shift strategy away from a robustness towards Russia because of all the veto players and all the trouble it creates. And I think the Italians have played a very shrewd game of, they were a little initially sketchy about going against Russia, but I think the Italian governments themselves realized how much of this was also in their own self-interest. And they are committed, I think, even the Italian fascists. I think that's an interesting signal for where some of the negative developments in European domestic politics down the line, where you look at FDE and Italian fascists and how they become kind of like gone from hostile to saying, oh, maybe this is about Christian Europe. That's very problematic. But all of that develops, and the Italians have shrewdly used this as transactionally too, to say, look, then help us with these Mediterranean issues. So all of this develops its momentum, the transactions, the trades, the deals are made, and now they're there and they're sitting there. And I think that actually means that European unity can last. The thing is that there will be a moment down the track. I suspect Ukraine will at least regain its territories in the south, like Zaporizhia and South Kherson. I suspect that's the case. Whether after that, Ukraine military is so exhausted it can move further, or whether the war then falls into a more kind of a ceasefire is punctuated by artillery fire and Russia remains permanently sectioned off from Europe for a long period of time, we'll have to see. At some point, the EU will then have to shift to a different strategy towards Russia. Worst case scenario for me is not just Russian aggression. Another worst case scenario is that Russia falls apart. Not now, but maybe in the succession struggle over Putin. I think the idea that Russia breaks up into different states is ridiculous. I don't think that's happening. I think it's just there will the potentiality of violence is more about different factions fighting for control of Moscow. That's maybe I feel a substantial risk that's underpriced. No, not the most likely one, but it's likely enough to worry about. All of that stuff will require the EU to have a strategy, a set of responses to Russia, to think about Russia not just in terms of what's happening next week or next month or next year, but having a clear idea of what kind of Russia does the EU want.
Do you think that we should try to address it now?
People will accuse that of being imperialist or colonial, but governments do that all the time. Every government sits there and says, how would we prefer this state next to us to be? Right? It doesn't mean that state can impose its preferences on that other country. It just has a certain strategic vision of developments would like to assist in its neighbor, how it would like to lobby and engage with it, in the hope that maybe, say, for the Europe, Russia does become Sweden with nukes. I know this sounds very unlikely now, but Sweden was an ultra aggressive empire once that burned down Prague, right? That once happened. So every state and country and nation can develop further. Portugal was a country that once laid waste to much of Angola and Mozambique in the 1960s. Look at what the French did to Algeria, and still lingering aspects of that philosophy, because we shouldn't just assume that Russia will forever be screwed up and aggressive. We also shouldn't assume that Russia will forever domestically stable. I mean, there are a lot of potentialities for arrival for armed violence. Not the most likely, but the EU needs to have a vision and a strategy for Russia's future and develop strategic tools to think about, we're at the moment. My final point on that is at the moment, the paradox is for years and years, we didn't have the EU and the UK and US did not have a Ukraine strategy because it was sort of seen as secondary. And if Russia's fixed, Ukraine is fixed and it's fine. And somehow it was sort of handled we now have, out of necessity, a clear strategic picture for where Ukraine is supposed to land. The disagreement is it going to be full membership of the EU or maybe something a bit more like Norway? I think that's the kind of basic, tension. But Ukraine is almost de facto getting close to full access to the single market. They have to work on the customs union a bit more because of those truck tail ups on the board. All that. What is our vision for Russia? We now no longer have a long-term strategy for Russia. The EU really has to sit down, and the next step is to think, okay, if we bring Ukraine in, what is our long-term relationship with Russia supposed to be? What developments in Russia do we want to assist? How do we have a kind of a Goldilocks Russia, not too aggressive, but also not too weak and dangerous and fractured and civil war-y? How do we help that along? I don't see that vision. I don't see that strategic thinking. And I think what we're ending up in is a very EU we just, got unity and we've dealt with this crisis and it's all fine. And then they just don't make the preparations to the other crisis that you can see coming at you, but it's over there so we can think about it. It will hit you fast and you'll find yourself unprepared for it again.
I think this is an important debate and I hope we can have this discussion sometimes down the road. But let me finish with something short-termish. Slovakia will elect a new government in September. It may happen that the opposition that is perceived as being closer to Russia will rule the country. As we talked about the unity of the EU, if Slovakia joins Hungary in its approach to Russia, do you think it might affect the EU's decisions? Hungary still acts as the outlier, but if there will be two countries with similar policies, perhaps even others might start to think twice.
Honestly, Slovakia, I know the opposition. I know how it's configured. And as with the Bulgarian government, right? You have rhetoric, but ultimately the Slovak governments have tended to be, there's a very few, the Slovak government, even the opposition is not necessarily going to put a lot of very comfortable arrangements for Slovakia at risk. The Slovak and Bulgarian oppositions or pro-Putin elements, I don't know, sure quite go so far, have always been good at talk, but they've also been very, very careful about not screwing things up. Also for their own base. I think Orban has miscalculated in a much more fundamental way, and it's actually just a product of the lack of checks and balances in the Hungarian system. And that Orban is part of a wider structural problem in which I think the war is important and it matters, but it's much more fundamentally about the extent to which he's built a kind of apparatus that for a while could coexist very comfortably with the EU system, and he actually drew a lot of funding from the EU system. But now so many of these contradictions don't work anymore. The EU has lost patience with him, and not just about Putin. I think a lot about domestic and other issues as well. And I think you're seeing a level of confrontation building up between Budapest and Brussels that I don't see between Bratislava and Brussels. I really don't see that happening. I think look at PIS. I think that much more it's going to be like the PIS outcome, where it's just there's a lot of latent sympathy for Putin in Cyprus, right? And they don't get in the way, right? And I think there's also a military intelligence apparatus in Slovakia that is committed to helping Ukraine. So I don't really like Slovenia. They were supposedly, Janša was supposedly going to be on Team Putin. Suddenly he's showing up in Kiev and hugging Zelensky. So I really don't see Slovakia in the same bracket as Hungary. But that's also partly because however bad the opposition can be in Slovakia, maybe I'm wrong, but I think there are functioning checks and balances in the Slovak political system. And that's why Brussels tends to be like, all right, fine, you have to deal with these people. Oh God, they're awful, but fine. There's not the sense of like, oh, whereas with Orban, it's a different level. He has managed to completely dismantle democracy. In a way, even Borisov in Bulgaria never succeeded, right? And however problematic and nasty his governments have been and corrupt and just stagnant. But he's never quite got where Orban got. So I think there is a kind of a unique dynamic with Hungary that will be with us even if Russia loses the war soon. Right. And I don't have any answers for it, really, but I think that's going to get very, very nasty. But it won't necessarily affect support for